yo, God, like this thought is back once again. I've already failed. Like, do I need to do it again just to fail another time? I was afraid of man, and so I gave into them. Forget man at that point. Like, I'm not trying to be rejected. We're doing this, you're doing this, we're here, you're sitting down, you have a setup, you have lights, you have camera, everything. So I just want to say a quick shout out to my husband. Quick shout out to my husband for making this possible. Baby, I love you so much. I love you. Beautiful people, welcome to my podcast. Yo, we are finally sitting in the chair. We got a setup. We got a mic. A mic is crazy. I'm talking in a mic. You know how long I've always wanted to talk in a mic and have a podcast? Psh, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get into that. But guys, I just want to say welcome to my podcast. You are here. I am here. And if you are not sure what my podcast is, that means you didn't watch the introduction video, which I don't know why you didn't. It's just a minute-long video that explains what my podcast is. And so you should definitely go and check out that video once you're done listening to this one so that you can get a little bit context of what the podcast is about. But if you're too lazy and don't want to click out of this after you're done and watch that video, then let me give you a quick synopsis of what my podcast is. My podcast is just where me and you get to sit down and with our guests as well. And we aim to have culture shifting conversations. We aim to sit down and be able to figure out where God has designed each of us to play our part in this world. A lot of that looks like what's my purpose, especially in this culture. We love that P word, that purpose word, and just really want to figure out what God has designed us for. And so we do that here through listening through my stories. My husband is going to be on here often. We're going to have guests who are going to come and speak about how God's using them in doing their purpose, just to in hopes that you figure out what part God has called you to play in this world, in this puzzle, right? And where you fit in. And so that's just a little bit of synopsis. And so conversations about mental health, conversations about relationships, and conversations about faith will be had on this podcast. So you're in it for all. And that is a wide variety of things that we're going to be talking about. And so there's something here for you. I know that there is. And so tune in and figure out where you play in this puzzle. So today's episode is you're just with me. And we're chilling together. And I'm just going to quickly, go through why I decided to do this podcast, why you should be listening to me, why you should take time and listen to me, whether on YouTube or Spotify or Applepodcast, and just really just my heart in why we got this going. So I just want to quickly start with just saying thank you for even tuning in. I think whenever someone does something and you're afraid to put yourself out there, I know I was, and people do watch you, I just want to say a quick gratitude. And so thanks for tuning in. So let's get to the episode. Okay, so where does my story start? My story with this podcast thing goes way back, like way back. I think growing up, I've always had a gift of speaking. So people would tell me whether I was like on stage preaching, I used to preach, or whether it was just in conversations, like, especially like debate conversations, like I will always think that I am correct. And so people would naturally always tell me like, oh, wow, like you have, your voice is really cool. Like you have a gift in speaking, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, thank you. I think that's one of the main things. Like if you're trying to figure out like, okay, God, what is my part, is pay attention to what your friends, what your family tell you. Like let them, they observe you, they see you more often than other people. And so if they point out something that you're really good at, like pay attention to that. And so that was my case. People would tell me like, okay, you have a gift in speaking, in conversation. And I would be like, that's pretty cool. I enjoy talking to people, and not just talking to people about just whatever, but just like deeper conversations, like things that are thought-provoking. And so that's really where my interests start. And I would see stuff on, like internet and stuff, and people talking about things. I'm like, I got something to say too. Like, I got an opinion. So that's where I was, mostly started. And so after that, I quickly was like, okay, I don't necessarily want to be preaching on a stage with a mic. I just want to be talking to an audience. I want to be talking to people. I want to be just like with my friends. And so this podcast thing came to mind 2 years ago. And I was like, wait, why? And I think part of it is because I listen to a lot of podcasts, and so I'm obsessed with podcasts. Like, if you guys need podcast like suggestions, I got you. And so I really loved the podcast world, and I'm like, I would love to do something like that. And so my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, I let him know, and I'm like, hey, I'd love to do this. And so he helped me. Like, we started a little setup in his apartment, and so we got it all together. Nothing like this whatsoever, but it was just like, okay, let's start somewhere. And so we never actually filmed an episode. I think like we just got the setup kind of going, and I wasn't too serious about it, I think, at the time, and so it just kind of fell through. That was the first time. The second time, I was like, okay, no, this is for real this time. And I need to like bring in people who know what they're doing. And that's going to motivate me to like really get it going. And so my husband has a friend who like does filming and like really good with cameras and had a mic at the time too. Cause at the first time we didn't even have a mic. I think we're using like his music mic. And so the second time it was different. I was like, okay, all in, let's do this. Brought in people, whatever. We did record one or two episodes. And I even had a name of of the podcast. I had to put it on like the platform. And so this time I thought it was like, oh yeah, we're going to do it. It's going to soar off, blah, blah, blah. Recorded that 1 or 2 episodes, and it didn't go nowhere. Yo, when I tell you, like, I've tried this thing multiple times and failed. Like, keep going. This is not even the second time. There's a third time. The third time, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna quickly, like, start small. I'm gonna start small because I watched a YouTube episode and I got motivated, and I was like, I'm gonna start small. And then I was like, okay, let me just put out my camera, my iPhone camera, and just start recording things that I like to talk about or that I see on the internet that everyone has an opinion about, and I have an opinion about it too. So let me talk about it. And so I would pull out my camera, I would find some like little ring light, and I would start talking, and I would give out my thoughts, and it was pretty cool. I think I was pretty consistent with that because it was pretty easy. And so that was the third time. The third time I decided to go smaller, but that thought of like, I want to start a podcast never left my mind, but I just decided to like scale it down and just like, okay, let's just start small. Life events happen, and now we are here. It's been 2-3 years now. And the beginning of this year in January 2024, that thought of start a podcast came into mind again. And it never left. I would never say like it left. I just reality kicked in, and I'm like, okay, well, I failed so many times, so I'm just not gonna follow through with it. But the thought came back again, and this time everything was different. I was a mother. I am a mother now. I am a wife. I have like I work as well. And so it's just like a lot of huge like life events took place. And so when the thought start a podcast. I'm like, really? Like right now, like in the midst of like all the stuff I got going on. And so when that thought came back, I was intentional with praying about it. And I went to God. I was like, yo, God, like this thought is back once again. I've already failed. Like, do I need to do it again just to fail another time? And so, but this time something was so different, so very different. And it was that I really took some time to pray about it. I think the second time, the third time that I failed, I think the intentional like prayer was never really there. I think quick prayers were like, okay, God, I'm going to do this. Please bless it, blah, blah, blah. They were there, but like not as intentional as this time. And this time, like, I'm telling you, like, before you're seeing this episode, it's months of prayer, months of preparation, and just months of saying, okay, God, how are we going to do this? And intentionality. And so I want to walk through you guys, like, the Bible verse that kind of shifted, like, okay, God, me and you are going to do this, and we're going to walk in hand with it, and I'm going to follow through this time. And this Bible story comes from 1 Samuel chapter 15. And so if you want to get a full like background on this story, please pull out your Bible and go read it. I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis for me. And so we're going to walk through the story just a little bit, and there's some pointers, there's things that God was like, yeah, this is you. And so we're going to 1 Samuel 15. And this is where God goes to Samuel and gives him a message for the king at the time, who was Saul. And so God tells Samuel, go tell Saul to completely go and wipe out everything that Amalekites have, which is another city, place. And so Saul, the king of Israel at the time, gets this message, and Samuel goes and tells him this, and Saul goes and carries out that instructions. And so he goes, and then after that, Samuel gets another word from God. And this time the Lord tells Samuel, hey, I am really disappointed. Saul has not followed out my instructions. He has disobeyed me. And I regret making him king. That's the message that God gave to Saul the second time. And Samuel is heartbroken. And he's like, it says in the Bible that he cried all night long, which, hearing that word, like, hey, I've rejected, am disappointed in Saul. And I think really got to him. And so Samuel, gets another word from God, and that was the word, is like, go tell him that I've rejected him and he has been disobedient and not followed out my instructions. And so Samuel goes to Saul, and before Samuel even says anything, Saul sees him and like, yo, like, be blessed. I have done it, blah, blah, blah. God has blessed out and I've carried out the instructions. But in the background, Saul is hearing cattle noises and he's hearing sheep noises. And so Samuel is like, but what is that I hear what am I hearing? Why am I hearing sheep noises? Why am I hearing cattle noises? And so Saul says, oh, yeah, my army brought back some cattle and some sheep from the Amalekites. Mind you, that was a city that God told him to go destroy. And so Saul is sitting there talking about, yeah, the army brought back the cattle after the Lord said, no, destroy everything, which was the instruction. And so Samuel is like, enough. He's sick of it. And he's like, Samuel says to him, like, let me tell you what the Lord has said to me from last night. And Samuel says that although you were once small, did you not become head of the tribe of Israel? The Lord anointed you as king. And then verse 19 says, why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce and plunder and do evil in the Lord's eye? And just right there, and that was the message that God gave to Samuel to go tell Saul. And so he tells him this. And Saul, is still like justifying everything. He's still like, no, but I did obey the Lord. I did follow out the instructions. I completely wiped out everything. But I brought back King Agag, which was the Amalekites' king. He brought him back. And then on top of that, he says, in my army, they brought back the cattle and the sheep. That wasn't even me. They did it. And so which is it, Saul? Did you obey the Lord and his instructions? Because You brought back the king and the cattle, and the instruction was to wipe out everything that Amalekites have. So what are we doing? Why are you still justifying yourself, Saul? And so we go on, and Samuel says to him, he says, does the Lord delight in burnt offering and sacrifice as much as obeying in the Lord? He says in verse 22, to obey is better than sacrifice. And so Saul finally gets it. And he says in verse 24, I have sinned. I have violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of men, and so I gave in to them. And then he begs for forgiveness. But at that point, Samuel says, nope, the Lord has rejected you, or has regretted you as king and rejected you as king. And that is the story. And so there is parts of this story where I saw myself becoming a Saul. And God, after, when God first gave me this story to read, I meditated on it for months. I'm telling you, this Bible story, I would go back to it over and over again. And God began to show me how I was becoming a Saul. And listen to this. The first point for me that God showed was that God gives clear instructions. So if he gives clear instructions, why am I not following it fully? If you can, when we read this story, Saul was given clear instructions, right? And instead of carrying it out completely in totality, he carries it out in part. What does he do? He does wipe out the city, but he brings back the king, Agag, from the Amalekites, and he lets his army bring back the cattle and the sheep. So he carried out the instructions in part. He didn't do it in totality. And for me, that was what it was when I first started wanting to do this podcast thing, is that I would carry out God's instructions whenever he instructed me, hey, start this podcast. I would carry out the instructions in part. I wouldn't do it in totality, right? I would, for the first time I started, I got the setup and everything like that, but I didn't fully obey, and so it fell through. The second time, I did get all the equipment and stuff. And I got the mic and everything like that, but I didn't carry out in completion because I once again stopped, and because I wasn't intentional in prayer, it didn't go anywhere. And then the third time, although I was doing the Instagram reels and the little Instagram stories and even TikTok where I would talk and share my opinion and share what God's putting on my heart, and not saying that it was bad, but I didn't follow out the instructions in fully, because the instruction was to start a podcast. Me talking in little reels wasn't necessarily bad, and that God wasn't not using it. He was, but that was not the instruction. And I think a lot of times God gives us clear instructions and we don't follow through in totality. We do it in part and said, okay, God, I did follow your instructions. I obeyed. And that's exactly what Saul was doing. That's the first point. The second point that God revealed to me is the blame of others. I don't know if you guys remembered, but there's several times when Saul would justify himself in saying that, like, oh no, I brought back the king, but it was the army that brought back the cattle and the sheep. So it wasn't fully my fault. Although Saul, he gave you the instructions, not your army. So you can't even blame them. Why are you blaming your army? And so how many times do we do that? For me, I would blame everything and everybody on why I wasn't starting this podcast and why I didn't follow through with the instructions. And so I would think about the first part. Oh, I don't have the equipment. I don't even have a mic. And then the second part, but like, what am I going to speak about? Like, this is not working, but I have school. I'm in college. Fell, right? And so I would make every excuse, just like Saul was doing. I would blame people, I would blame myself, and that would cause me to not follow the instructions. And it's so funny. It's like, why do we even do that? Because it's like, God didn't give those people that instructions. He gave you the instructions. So why are you not following through with it? You know what I mean? And it's like Saul, God didn't give the army instructions to wipe out everything. He didn't do that. He gave it to you. He gave it to you as the king and said, you go and completely destroy everything. So it is your responsibility to hold them accountable. But that leads to our third and final point. Just like Saul, just like Saul, he says something in verse 24 that I heavily related to. And it was that in verse 24, Saul says, I was afraid of men, and so I gave in to them. Oh, y'all hear that? He says, I was afraid of men, and so I gave in to them. And what that means is that Saul was so scared of what men would think, of what the army would think, and he gave in to them, and that caused him to not follow the Lord's instructions fully because he was scared of what people would think. He was scared of what they were gonna say. And I know all of us can relate to that. And that, again, was me. That was me. And when I'm telling you, God was like, yeah, you're a Saul. I was like, I understand. I'm a Saul because the fear that I have in what people are going to think when God gave me that instruction to do the podcast was so real. I would say that was probably my number one fear was like, oh, but what are people going to think when does my voice even do I even have enough to say? Like, are people going to listen to it? Like, I was so afraid of men that I would give into them, just like Saul. And I think that that's the reality for a lot of us, right? We're so afraid of what people are going to think. And so we don't step into that thing. We don't follow out the instruction that God gave us because we simply fear what people are going to think over fearing what God has instructed us to do. And that's crazy. Like when I think about this is like, why would I care so much about what people think that I would give into them and give into that over the fear of God? Like when God says, I rejected you as king because you did not follow my instructions, you did not obey. Like, I would forget man at that point. Like, I'm not trying to be rejected. And that's what I told God. I told him, I'm not trying to be rejected, Lord. No. My fear for you, God, is way greater than my fear of men. My fear for you, God, is way greater than the fear of man. And so I'm going to obey and I'm going to follow your instructions because I will not be regretted. I will not be regretted. And so help me to obey and not to sacrifice more than that. Because although both are important, help me to obey, Lord. And so that's something that we have to think about is our fear over man, which is so crazy. Like, why do we do that? Why do we think that our fear of people is so much greater than the fear of God? It should be the other way around. And so that's my story. And that's really why I got to this point of like, okay, I'm going to do it. My fear of being rejected by God. And I laugh when I say this, but when God first gave me this word, I was scared. And I took it to my husband and my aunt. I'm not trying to be rejected. Like, this is what the Lord has given me. And so I brought it to them because I was like, you're not trying to be rejected too. So whatever God is calling you to do, whatever God has instructed you to do, please obey so that we don't become like Saul and become rejected. So that's my message to you today. What is that thing that God has instructed you to do? What is that thing that you haven't carried out? Because either one, you have excuses, or two, you have fear of what men are going to think, or three, following up the instructions in part and not in totality, right? So think of that. And for me, I think now I'm at a point where God has. Because I think I'm at a point because God has fully instructed me to do something. I'm tired of being disobedient. And it's so good. God is so good because when he gives you instructions, he will provide the things necessary for you to do it. And I'm not saying like, oh, he'll give you financially everything. No, like a lot of the times, like you already have the resources to start that thing or to carry out that instruction. And so look around you, like even everything from this setup, everything is what we already had at home. And God provided someone to help financially provide equipment. And so there's no reason why. In this podcast, my major was in psychology, and so I'm currently working a very cool job as a crisis counselor. And so you will be getting a lot of psychology facts. You will be getting a lot of statistics. You will be getting a lot of it. And so today I want to talk about neophobia. And neophobia is the fear of trying new things. And how many of us have the fear of trying new things? And so neophobia could affect and hinder people from doing everyday activities, such as trying new foods, especially in children. Trying new foods is big for them, but in adults, doing new activities, traveling, and all those things. And it can really hinder people from doing everyday activities, right? And it can affect them mentally, socially, and physically even. And so neophobia is really real. And I'm not saying that a lot of us have neophobia. I think to an extent, a lot of us have the fear of trying new things from various different reasons. But as you think about what things you have fear in, as you think about the instructions that you haven't carried out, and as you think about the fear of things, I pray that you don't allow that fear to overcome. That you how do I say this? That you fear being rejected by God because you didn't obey his instructions more than that fear that you have. That's my prayer. And so may God go with you. It's going to be so exciting as we journey together, as we have more conversations. And so thank you for tuning in to our very first episode. Like, we are here. We've made it. And I'm glad that you're here. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to follow on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast at, whether it's YouTube or Apple, Spotify. Comment, like, subscribe, share. And especially if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, make sure you leave a rating, because God's trying to do something, and so help me out, okay? And I pray that you are blessed, and we'll see you guys next time and on the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to my podcast.